Hello, my name's Annette Pateman. I'm the writer in residence at the Thunder Bay Public Library 2021. And I have been given a grant by the Ontario Arts Council to be writer in residence and also to do some research on folklore and fairy tales. And today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about folklore, which is something that I very much love and enjoy. Okay. So we can start on with the idea of what is folklore. So what do you think of when you think of folklore, you hear that word? Where have you heard the word folklore before? If someone asked you what folklore is, what would you say? Okay. What folklore is not? Folklore is not necessarily untrue, rural, or old-fashioned. Folklore is not just another form of anthropology or literary study. Folklore is not high art or part of the official culture. And folklore is not popular culture either. So, what folklore is? Well, folklore is informally learned and it's unofficial. It's part of the everyday experience. Folklore is part of the vernacular. It uses localized language, objects and practices of groups within a specific context. Folklore is that which is locally defined. It's produced locally and it is expressed often in a local way also. Folklore has artistic, creative, or expressive dimensions. Okay, here are some definitions of folklore. Okay, folklorists or people that study folklore and talk about it and express this form of knowledge. So, folklorists, who are they? Well, they are concerned with the study of traditional culture or the unofficial culture or the folk culture, as opposed to the elite cultures. Not for the sake of proving a thesis, but to learn about the mass of humanity, overlooked by the conventional disciplines. So says the folklorist Richard Dawson. Richard Dawson is a folklorist that, he's an American folklorist that lived in 1916 and died in 1981. He is a folklorist and professor who helped revolutionize the way that folklore is studied and taught. Going on to Lynn McNeil, she's an American folklorist and professor who works extensively with urban legends and contemporary folklore. And Lynn McNeil says about folklore, folklore is informal and traditional culture. The two folklorists, Martha Sims and Martine Stevens, say of folklore, folklore is informally learned, unofficial knowledge about the world and about ourselves and our communities, our beliefs, our cultures and our traditions that is expressed creatively through words, music, customs, actions, behaviours and materials. It is also the interactive, dynamic process of creating, communicating and performing as we share that knowledge with other people. And that is a quote from Martha Sims and Martine Stevens. Martha Sims and Martine Stevens are folklorists and teachers who wrote the textbook Living Folklore, an introduction to the study of people and their traditions. This book is often used to introduce students to the study of folklore. The folklorist Dan Ben Amos says that folklore is the artistic communication in small groups. Ben Amos is an Israeli-American folklorist and professor who published widely in folklore studies and specializes in Jewish folklore. Okay, some examples. The piece of folklore that really interests me is the folklore that we find in writing. And I'll talk a little bit about that. So we have folk narrative, and examples of folk narrative are folk tales, fairy tales, personal narratives, family narratives, local character anecdotes, tall tales, historical legends, supernatural legends, urban legends, and mythological stories. So all of this produces a lot of grist for the writer, and it's very exciting. And I'm sure we all have favourite folk tales or favourite fairy tales that we heard growing up and as children. And then there's those tall tales that you might hear if you go to a bar or a pub. You might hear a group of people talking about something and you're not quite sure if it's true or if it's not true. This falls under folk narrative, and those supernatural legends that we hear about, and things that we hear about, family stories. Maybe it's somebody that passed that you never ever met yourself, but you've heard about that person. That person becomes almost like a legend within the family, and those stories. So all of this is an example of folklore, and is something that interests writers very, very much. And this is why, one of the reasons why folklore so interests me, because the folk tales, the fairy tales, the personal stories, urban legends, mythological stories, all of these things are a huge area for writers to explore. But also other examples of folklore are folk music, folk games and dances, folk crafts, also folk art. We have the arts and crafts movement that started in 1880 and went on to the 1920s. And this influenced the British Art Nouveau movement, which is famous globally and all over the world. So folk art. We also have folk jokes. We also have a lot of folklore around holidays and holiday traditions and festivals. For example, at Christmas, we might hang mistletoe. We might have stories around and folklore around the Christmas stocking. We might have stories around Easter and the Easter Bunny, for example. So these are all examples of folklore. Internet memes and how they start, and what they do and who they represent, and who they are. Folk beliefs, so many different beliefs within countries, within regions, within areas. Folk medicine. So that also exists. Sometimes there are stories around certain plants and what they can and cannot do, how they will affect a person, how they won't affect a person. And latrinalia. This one made me smile when I came across it, but these are the informal writings that we will find in a public restroom. So this also falls under folklore. So who are the folk? The term folk can refer to any group of people whatsoever who share at least one common factor. So says the folklorist Alan Dundes. This means, in fact, that we are all folk. We are all the folk. We all participate in groups of one sort or another, whether they be small or large. It could be a group of young people, a group of older people, a group of mothers, a group of people who go golfing or bowling, or a class of students. So we all participate in groups that lead to folklore. There are thousands of ways to categorize different folk groups, but some of the most common are gender. So we will have, there is some folklore around teenagers, for example, who they are, who that group is, older people, and also the family. There's folklore around occupation. I'm thinking of like the woodcutter in the story of Red Riding Hood, for example, or people, carpenters, or people, or doctors and nurses. There will be folklore around the group, or teachers. There can be folklore around your social network, your age set. Talked a little bit about younger people, older people, toddlers. Religion. There can be a folklore around a place. When I was looking at this, I was thinking of the Loch Ness Monster in Scotland. They have the lochs, the beautiful bodies of water, like the lakes. There are some stories there about a monster that lives in this loch. So there's folklore around that. And ethnicity, there's folklore around ethnicity also. When looking at folklore, it is always important to consider context. Folklore genres. So the folklore genres, this is how folklorists organize the materials that they study. They organize the materials that they study into three main categories, and these are the verbal category, the material, and the customary. The verbal or the oral folklore are things like folk tales, folk myths, oral storytelling, jokes, personal narratives. So those can fall into the verbal or oral folklore genre. Material folklore, this would be the things like folk art. We talked about the arts and crafts movements, but the folk art and crafts. And again, I was thinking of things like materials could be also things like the magic broomstick, or horseshoe, the folklore that's grown up around those metal horseshoes, and which one's a lucky horseshoe, and that sort of thing. And in some places there are lucky spoons, which are beautifully carved spoons. There's also customary folklore, which I mentioned, and this is to do with superstitions and folk beliefs, the customs, folklore, the customary folklore. So folk tales, including Anansi stories, are part of the verbal genre, the oral storytelling that has been passed down through families and across the oceans, actually, through the largely African diaspora. So Anansi stories come under the folk tales, and it's the verbal genre. So why does folklore matter? Well, folklore is a type of social connection that brings people together and helps connect people. Folklore often reveals what people care about and value, because this is what they tell stories about, the things that really matter to them, and often the stories they tell their children. Folklore flies under the radar because it is not often noticed or considered. Its influence is often unexamined, which means it has the opportunity to thrive. Anansi tales. Anansi is a popular folktale character that appears in West African, African American and Caribbean folklore. His name means spider, and in many tales, he is actually a spider or he can transform into one. Sometimes he's a spider with a human face or a human with a spider with spider features. For example, he can have 8 legs. Anansi is also a trickster and a demigod character. Folktale or myth. Anansi stories are usually categorized as folk tales. So those are stories that are known to be fiction by the people listening to them, reading them, and telling them. Myths are stories that are considered deeply true and sacred to the communities that tell them. So we have some famous myths: Odysseus, Jason and the Argonauts, story of Icarus, who flew too close to the sun. Some stories depict Anansi as a god, or at least a character who interacts with gods. And that moves him into the folklore category of myth. There are some who consider him to be a mythological and therefore a religious figure. Anansi, slavery, and resistance. So Anansi stories or Anansi tales were circulated widely in West Africa. When slave traders abducted people from West Africa and took them to the Caribbean and the US, Anansi stories traveled with them. In his tales, Anansi generally outsmarts, tricks, and triumphs over his more powerful enemies. He's often, in the stories, Anansi stories, Anansi's often with the other animals who are around him in the forest. And they're often bigger than he is. And he often finds ways to get the better of those other animals. So he's cunning, he's got immense creativity and mental acumen. And this allows him to achieve his victories over the other animals. And sometimes there are people involved as well. Many Anansi tales are stories of resistance where an underdog can win against impossible odds. These are powerful tales for people who have been enslaved to tell. Anansi the trickster. Anansi is what folklorists refer to as a trickster or a trickster god. These characters are often extremely cunning and creative, and they often make mistakes and they do silly things. And sometimes the other characters wonder, what is this? What is Anansi doing? And sometimes they laugh at Anansi, but Anansi often has the last laugh. Trickster characters frequently act as stand-in characters for people. They also often interact with humanity. Okay. I'm going to talk a little bit about my book. I have a book called, which I've written, called Anansi and the Turtle. And it was great fun writing the book. And it was based on, it's a well-known story about Anansi and the turtle, but this is a story that my father also told me. My father was Jamaican, and both my parents were Jamaican, and my father in particular told a lot of Anansi stories. And so when he passed, I decided that I would write down some of his stories. And so this is the one I wrote, Anansi and the turtle. And in this story, Anansi goes fishing and he catches turtle. And what happens is, you will have to see, so the adventures that Anansi has with turtle, and that a turtle has with Anansi, and what happens in the story. So it is a children's picture book. My book is available at Thunder Bay Public Library in all the different branches, but also you can get it online from the usual outlets. Okay. So Anansi and popular culture. So Anansi, the character, has appeared in numerous films and books and comics and other media over the years. The famous writer Neil Gaiman, his famous novels about gods in modern times, American Gods and Anansi Boys, both feature Anansi as a major character. In Nalo Hopkinson's novel, the Jamaican Caribbean, the Jamaican Canadian American writer, she writes in her novel Midnight Robber. She writes about a ruling government in that. She's a speculative fiction. She writes lots of speculative fiction and poetry. And she writes in her novel The Midnight Robber about a government called the Grand Nancy Web. And that is because of its web of surveillance. So she calls it the Grand Nancy Web. Anansi the Spider also appeared in cartoon form to tell African folk tales on Sesame Street. He was often voiced by Ossie Davis. The children's singer Raffi wrote and recorded the song Anansi. So Anansi in popular culture. Okay, thank you so much for listening to this talk on folklore and Anansi stories, and I hope that you enjoyed it and understand why I, as a writer, would be so interested in folklore and all the great stories that are out there to be told, that you may have in your own family, and beliefs that people have, folklore beliefs. So I hope you enjoyed the talk. Thank you so much.